The spring weather in the Greenvale suburbs was fresh and serene. Rows of red-tiled houses stood close together, surrounded by vibrant gardens, and the clean, straight streets were the pride of the community. The residents of Greenvale took great pride in calling their neighborhood a place for ideal families. But everything began to change on an early Monday morning when a moving truck parked in front of house number 17, which had been vacant for nearly 6 months. Walter Blake, who had lived in house number 16 for over 20 years, stood at his second-floor window, watching. The truck carried carefully wrapped furniture, and uniformed movers were busily unloading it. Walter squinted as he saw a black family step out of the SUV parked behind the truck. The family consisted of a tall, serious-looking man, his wife, and 2 children, a boy and a girl. Walter felt a weight drop into his chest as if a stone had just landed there. "Linda, did you see this? What is happening to the house next door?" Walter shouted, his voice full of agitation. Linda, his wife, was trimming the rose bushes in the yard and looked up. "Maybe they're decent people. Walter, don't jump to conclusions," she replied. But Walter wasn't listening. To him, the arrival of Marcus's family was a threat to the peace he had cherished for so long. Marcus Brown, the black man who had just moved in, paid no attention to the scrutinizing eyes from the neighboring house. He was too busy helping his wife, Sarah, unpack their belongings. Their 2 children, Jordan and Emma, ran excitedly around the yard, full of energy. Marcus smiled as he watched his kids, but there was a trace of unease in his heart. He understood that moving into an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood wouldn't be easy. Still, he believed that kindness and hard work would help his family integrate and find acceptance. The next day, Marcus decided to do what he always believed was the right thing: introduce himself to his neighbors. He prepared a plate of homemade cookies and 2 cups of hot coffee, then walked over to the house next door. He knocked on the door with a friendly smile. Walter opened the door, his cold eyes scanning Marcus. "What do you want?" Walter asked, his tone sharp. "I'm Marcus Brown. My family and I just moved into house number 17. I just wanted to stop by, say hello, and introduce myself." Marcus held up the plate of cookies, his smile unwavering. Walter crossed his arms, making no move to shake Marcus's hand. "I'm not interested. You can keep your cookies." With that, he slammed the door in Marcus's face. Marcus stood still for a moment, feeling a surge of anger rise within him, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had done the right thing. Turning around, he walked back home, determined not to let Walter's rudeness affect him. That morning, Marcus woke up early as usual. He stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, but as soon as he opened the door, he was greeted by a strange sight. Trash from Walter's house was scattered across his front yard. Scraps of paper, leftover food containers, and beer bottles lay strewn about, emitting an unpleasant odor. Marcus stood still for a moment, narrowing his eyes, taking a deep breath. He bent down and began picking up the trash, carrying it to his own garbage bin. As he cleaned, Walter emerged from his house, holding a cup of coffee, his face laced with smug defiance. Leaning casually against his porch railing, he smirked. "Good morning, Mr. Brown," Walter drawled mockingly. "Looks like the wildlife around here has taken a liking to your yard. Such a shame." Marcus looked up, meeting Walter's gaze without a word. He continued picking up the last pieces of trash and then returned to his house. Ignoring the provocation, he knew that giving in to anger would mean losing. But Walter's actions didn't stop there. The following morning, as Marcus's family was having breakfast, loud music suddenly blared from Walter's house. The pounding bass shook the windows. Emma, Marcus's young daughter, covered her ears, her face scrunched up in discomfort. "Dad, I can't study," she said, her eyes welling with tears. Marcus set down his coffee cup and glanced toward the window. He could see Walter standing in his yard, holding a beer can and nodding along to the music as if deliberately mocking them. Sarah stepped up beside Marcus, placing a hand on his shoulder. You can't let him keep doing this. You need to talk to him. Marcus nodded. He walked out the door and approached the fence separating their properties. Walter noticed him, turned off the music, and sauntered over, his face radiating smug satisfaction. What do you want, Brown? Walter asked with a mocking tone. Mr. Blake, I don't know why you're doing this, but you're disturbing my family. I ask that you respect the shared space between our homes, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Walter sneered. Respect? I'm just enjoying my own yard. If you don't like it, maybe you should pack up and leave. This place might not be the right fit for you. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment, though anger burned inside him. He turned and walked away without responding further. He refused to let his emotions boil over in front of someone who was clearly trying to provoke him. But the harassment didn't stop. Over the next few days, Walter repeatedly left trash in Marcus's yard, played loud music at all hours, and occasionally stood outside Marcus's house, loudly making snide, veiled remarks to other neighbors. Despite it all, Marcus remained composed, focusing on his work and family, though he could feel the tension steadily building. That evening, after cleaning up the trash Walter had deliberately tossed into his yard, Marcus walked into the house with a tired expression. Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen, gripping a dish towel tightly in her hands, her face filled with worry. You have to do something, Marcus, she said, her voice edged with unease. He's clearly trying to provoke us. We can't let him keep this up. Marcus sighed and sat down in a chair. He knew his wife was right, but the thought of confronting Walter left him discouraged. Sarah, I understand how you feel, but if I react strongly, it'll only give him more fuel to escalate. We need to stay calm. Sarah sat across from him, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and fear. Stay calm? You've been staying calm for weeks now, but I see him pushing harder and harder. If we don't do something, he'll think we're weak, that we don't belong here. Marcus met her gaze, then reached for her hand. I understand, Sarah, but we can't let him drag us down to his level. I believe that kindness and patience will be the answer. Sarah pressed her lips together, knowing she couldn't change her husband's resolve. She only hoped his approach would work. In the days that followed, Marcus tried to integrate into the neighborhood by attending community meetings. However, he quickly realized that skeptical glances and hushed whispers made it difficult to form connections. Most of the neighbors seemed to follow Walter's lead, avoiding any real interaction with the Brown family. One afternoon, Marcus decided to work in the backyard, repairing an old wooden table. As he hammered and sanded the surface, his son, Jordan, ran out with a toy airplane in his hands. Dad, can I play out here? Jordan asked with a bright smile. Of course, son, Marcus replied, smiling back. But within minutes, a loud thud came from the fence. Jordan's toy airplane had accidentally flown into Walter's yard. Before Marcus could react, Walter appeared, holding the airplane in his hand. He raised it high, glaring at Marcus and the boy. This yours? Walter asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Yes, sir, Marcus replied, keeping his voice calm. I apologize for the disturbance. I'll come over and retrieve it. Walter smirked, and then, suddenly, he hurled the airplane to the ground with force, shattering it into pieces. Jordan gasped, his eyes wide with shock. Marcus felt a sharp pang in his chest, but he swallowed his anger. He stepped forward, picked up the broken pieces, and gently guided Jordan back into the house without saying another word. That night, as Marcus and Sarah sat together, Jordan suddenly spoke up. Dad, why does the neighbor hate us? His son's innocent question felt like a dagger to Marcus's heart. He looked at Jordan, then at Sarah, and in that moment, he understood that his restraint wasn't just about protecting his family. It was about teaching his children the importance of patience and the strength of kindness. Marcus resolved to stay true to his principles. But he also realized that, sooner or later, he would have to confront Walter to protect his family and their peace. That evening, the weather turned unusually cold, but Walter remained outside in his yard, gripping a bottle of beer in his hand. His eyes, glazed from the alcohol, were fixed on Marcus's house, filled with a hatred that he didn't bother to hide. When he saw Marcus step outside to water the plants, Walter couldn't hold back and decided to cross the fence. "Mr. Brown," Walter shouted, his voice slurred. "Who do you think you are? Coming here? This neighborhood isn't for people like you." Marcus paused, lowering the hose, and looked directly at Walter without saying a word. He could sense the danger in Walter's tone. From inside the house, Sarah watched with growing concern. She called out loudly, "Marcus, come inside." But Marcus raised a hand, signaling her to stay calm. Walter stumbled a few steps closer, the beer sloshing in his hand. "I told you to leave, didn't I? Or do you want me to make you leave myself?" Walter's voice grew louder and more unsteady. Marcus stood firm, his voice low but resolute. "Mr. Blake, I don't understand why you hate me, but I won't let you threaten my family. You should go home and calm down." Marcus's words only seemed to inflame Walter's anger. He lunged forward, raising the beer bottle in his hand. Marcus stepped aside just in time, and the bottle smashed on the ground, shards of glass scattering everywhere. Sarah screamed, and Jordan and Emma ran to the door, their faces pale with fear. Remaining calm, Marcus grabbed Walter's wrist to stop him from escalating further. "You need to stop. Now," Marcus said, his voice firmer than ever. Walter tried to wrench free, but his lack of control caused him to stumble and fall to the ground. Several neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered nearby, watching the scene with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah quickly called the police. When they arrived, Walter was still sitting on the ground, muttering curses under his breath. The officers assessed the situation but didn't arrest Walter, as his actions were deemed minor disorderly conduct. Marcus, unwilling to escalate the issue, requested only that a report be filed. Walter glared at Marcus as the officers escorted him back to his house but said nothing more. Later that night, the Brown family sat together in the living room. Sarah held Marcus's hand tightly, her eyes filled with worry. "You can't keep doing this, Marcus. He attacked us. What if he hurts the kids next time?" Marcus nodded, but his emotions were a swirling mix of frustration and resolve. He didn't want to be the one to escalate the conflict, but he also couldn't let his family live in fear. Deep down, he knew that from this moment on, their lives in the neighborhood would never be peaceful again. The next day, news of the altercation between Marcus and Walter spread throughout the neighborhood. Many neighbors began gossiping, with most siding with Walter due to their long-standing relationships with him. Others chose to remain neutral, unwilling to get involved in the drama. The Brown family became the center of attention, but not in a positive way. Meanwhile, Walter carried on with his life as if nothing had happened. However, he began to feel uneasy. The incident the previous night not only embarrassed him in front of the neighbors, but also forced him to confront the reality that Marcus wasn't someone who could be easily bullied. Marcus decided not to let the situation derail his family's life. He continued his daily routines, tending to the garden, playing with his children, and even participating in community activities. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle coldness from those around him. One morning, while Marcus was shopping at the nearby grocery store, he overheard two women whispering nearby. "I heard he started it. Who knows? They're often like that," one of them said, casting a disdainful glance in his direction. Marcus remained silent and walked on, but inside, he felt as if thousands of needles were piercing his heart. When Marcus returned home, Sarah was waiting for him with a cup of tea. She placed the cup on the table and looked at him with compassion. "How was it today?" she asked softly. Marcus shook his head, not saying anything, but Sarah understood. That evening, as the family sat together, Marcus decided it was time to talk to his children. "I know things have been hard lately," he began, his voice calm and gentle. "But I want you to know that we won't let anyone else decide our worth. We live with kindness and dignity. That's what truly matters." Jordan and Emma nodded, their young faces serious as they listened to their father. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand, silently affirming his words. Despite the challenges, the Brown family held onto their core values, determined to weather the storm together. 2 weeks after the incident with Walter, a special event took place in the city. A city council meeting was scheduled, with the main agenda being the introduction of the newly elected mayor. Most residents of the Greenvale neighborhood didn't pay much attention to politics, but Walter, who had connections with several people in local government, decided to attend. When Marcus stepped onto the podium as the new mayor, the entire room fell into stunned silence. Walter, seated in the back row, sat with his mouth agape, unable to believe his eyes. The man he had insulted, harassed, and attacked was now the leader of the city. Marcus maintained a calm demeanor, but his eyes shone with determination. He began his speech by thanking those who had supported him, then proceeded to outline his vision for a united community free of discrimination. Every word he spoke felt like a dagger to Walter's pride. Walter lowered his head, the weight of humiliation settling heavily on him. As the meeting concluded, several Greenvale residents, including some who had previously treated Marcus with indifference, began to look at him with newfound respect. They realized that this man possessed not only leadership qualities but also extraordinary patience and a rare capacity for forgiveness. Walter, meanwhile, left the meeting without a word, his mind racing as he grappled with the consequences of his actions. Marcus, unshaken, walked out of the hall with his head held high, ready to lead the city with dignity and fairness. Walter returned home with a troubled mind. He couldn't stop thinking about the humiliation of discovering that Marcus, the man he had looked down on, held a level of power far beyond anything he could have imagined. He wondered if Marcus would use his position as mayor to seek revenge. In the days that followed, Walter began avoiding Marcus. He no longer played loud music or let trash spill into his neighbor's yard. However, deep inside, he still felt bitterness and anger. Linda, his wife, noticed the change. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Linda decided to speak up. "Walter, do you think you can keep living like this? I know you hate Marcus, but don't you think you were wrong to treat him and his family that way?" Linda asked, her voice calm but firm. Walter said nothing. He didn't want to admit his wife was right, yet he couldn't deny the shame gnawing at him. Standing up abruptly, he walked to their bedroom, leaving Linda alone. But as he lay down, a question he didn't want to confront echoed in his mind. If Marcus isn't seeking revenge, why am I so afraid? Marcus, on the other hand, paid little attention to Walter's shift in behavior. He knew there was still much work to be done to mend relationships within the community. Yet deep down, he also understood that Walter represented one of the greatest challenges he would have to face. Marcus decided it was time to take action to bring the community together and foster unity. After many nights of reflection and discussions with Sarah, he organized a community meeting at the Greenvale Neighborhood Center. Invitations were sent to all residents, including Walter Blake. That evening, the small hall was packed. Many attended out of curiosity, some out of obligation, and others, like Walter, came only to see what Marcus would do. Walter sat in the back, arms crossed, his face set in a scowl. He didn't like Marcus's presence, let alone the idea of listening to him speak. Marcus stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed a few disdainful looks but also caught glimpses of friendliness and curiosity. He began his speech with a warm and heartfelt tone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I know some of you aren't used to gatherings like this, but I believe that for a community to thrive, we need to understand one another and work together. I've lived here for a few months now, and I've come to see that Greenvale is a wonderful place. But I also know that differences can create distance between us. Marcus shared his story about growing up, detailing the challenges he faced in a world rife with prejudice. He didn't mention Walter by name, but everyone in the room understood he was referencing the recent incidents of harassment. I believe the strength of a community isn't in how alike we are, but in how we accept and respect our differences, Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. His words left a profound impression. Some neighbors began to feel a pang of guilt for avoiding the Brown family. Walter, though still maintaining a cold demeanor, felt a flicker of doubt stir within him. As the meeting continued, Marcus invited residents to share their own thoughts and experiences. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. A few people spoke about their own struggles with prejudice, while others expressed a desire for more inclusivity in the neighborhood. Even those who had been indifferent found themselves moved by Marcus's sincerity and determination. Walter remained silent, his arms still crossed, but his mind raced. For the first time, he began to question whether his actions toward Marcus were justified, or simply fueled by fear and prejudice he had never dared to confront. Walter returned home after the meeting with a whirlwind of emotions. He sat in the living room, holding a glass of whiskey but not drinking it. Marcus's words echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. Linda entered the room and sat down beside him. "What did you think of the meeting?" she asked, her tone gentle but probing. Walter didn't answer immediately. He shook his head before finally saying, "I don't understand why everyone supports him. He's just trying to put on a show." Linda sighed. "Walter, don't you see? He's not doing this for attention or support. He's doing it because he genuinely wants what's best for all of us, including you." Walter fell silent. Linda's words unsettled him. He didn't want to admit that Marcus was genuinely trying to build a better community or that he himself had been in the wrong. But deep down, he began to feel a growing sense of shame for his actions. In the days that followed, Walter became consumed by anxiety. He feared that Marcus might use his position as mayor to seek revenge. This fear kept him in a constant state of tension. He avoided Marcus whenever possible, yet the unease clung to him like a shadow, refusing to let go. One day, Marcus organized a community event at the Central Park, aiming to create opportunities for neighbors to meet and get to know each other. The event featured activities like workshops, games for children, and an outdoor barbecue. Linda encouraged Walter to attend, but he refused outright. "I don't have time for this fake nonsense," he said gruffly. "Walter, you need to stop living with so much hate," Linda replied, her tone firm. "If you don't change, you're only going to isolate yourself. That's no way to live." Eventually, Walter reluctantly agreed to go, mostly to appease Linda. When he arrived, he felt out of place. People were chatting and laughing, while he stood alone, feeling disconnected from the world around him. Marcus, noticing Walter in the distance, walked over with a smile. "Hello, Mr. Blake. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the event," Marcus said warmly. Walter nodded but said nothing. He felt uneasy in the face of Marcus's friendly demeanor. As the event went on, Walter began to participate in a few activities. He played a game of chess with an elderly neighbor, struck up a conversation with a few other residents, and gradually started to feel more at ease. Linda watched from afar, smiling as she saw her husband beginning to engage, even if only for a little while. A week after the event, Walter decided to visit Marcus's house. Standing at the front door, hat in hand, he felt a mix of nerves and hesitation. Linda had encouraged him to do this, but it still felt like a monumental effort. When Marcus opened the door, he was surprised to see Walter standing there. "Mr. Blake, is something the matter?" Marcus asked politely. Walter took a deep breath and said, I came to apologize. I was wrong to treat you and your family the way I did. I have no excuse. I just hope you can forgive me." Marcus looked at Walter, his eyes reflecting both surprise and understanding. He nodded and replied, "Thank you for saying that, Mr. Blake. Forgiveness isn't always easy, but I believe anyone can change if they truly want to." Walter felt a sense of relief, though he knew that the apology was only the first step. He needed to act to prove he genuinely wanted to change. As Walter walked away, Marcus stood at the door, watching him go. Sarah came up behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Do you think he's sincere?" she asked. Marcus gave a small smile. "I don't know, but it's a start." From that moment on, things began to shift. Walter gradually became more involved in community activities, making an effort to connect and make amends for his past behavior. While there was still much to prove, he had genuinely started down the path of change. Walter woke up on a spring morning, soft sunlight streaming through the window curtains. As he looked into the bathroom mirror, he saw the face of a man who seemed to have aged a few years in just a few months. Sleepless nights and lingering guilt had left their mark. Linda, his wife, had become a source of great encouragement. She urged Walter to participate more in community activities and to try connecting with the neighbors. Though he still felt awkward, Walter realized he couldn't continue living in bitterness and isolation. He started by joining a park cleanup event organized by Marcus. It was a beautiful Sunday morning, and many residents from the neighborhood had come out to help. Walter, though quiet, diligently swept leaves and collected trash. From a distance, Marcus noticed him and gave a nod of acknowledgement, his expression filled with encouragement. While working, Walter overheard a group of neighbors chatting nearby. An older woman, Mrs. Margaret, said, "I never thought Mr. Blake would show up here, but it's nice to see him trying." Walter's face flushed at the comment, but he said nothing and kept working. After the cleanup, Marcus approached Walter. "Thank you for coming today," Marcus said, his smile genuine. "Your presence really means a lot." Walter, slightly flustered, replied, "I just wanted to do something useful. Thank you for organizing this." Gradually, Walter began to feel a change within himself. He no longer looked at Marcus with resentment. Instead, he found himself beginning to respect the man who had maintained patience and dignity in the face of hostility. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt the weight of his bitterness lifting. However, not everyone in the neighborhood was quick to accept Walter's change. Some of the neighbors who had previously supported his discriminatory behavior began to turn their backs on him. They saw Walter as a traitor for attempting to reconcile with Marcus and his family. One evening, Walter received a call from an old friend, Henry, who had once been his close ally during the days of opposing Marcus. "Walter, I heard you've been cozying up to Marcus. What's going on? Are you seriously siding with him now?" Henry asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Walter sat silently, gripping the phone tightly. After a few moments, he responded, "Henry, I've realized I was wrong. Marcus isn't the person we thought he was. He just wants to live a normal life and contribute to the community. I don't want to live in hatred anymore." Henry laughed derisively. "Wrong? You think you can change after just a few weeks? You think people will believe you?" The conversation ended on a tense note, leaving Walter with a heavy heart. Linda, noticing her husband's internal struggle, reassured him that while change was never easy, it was always worth pursuing. While Walter was grappling with his personal challenges, Marcus continued his work as mayor. He focused not only on the city's larger issues but also on fostering connections within the Greenvale community. One day, Marcus organized a workshop at the neighborhood activity center titled, "Understanding Differences to Build Unity." He invited experts and individuals with lived experiences to share their stories. The workshop drew a large crowd from Greenvale, including Walter, though he sat in the back row and remained silent. He listened intently. One of the speakers, a white woman who had grown up in a racially prejudiced family, shared her journey of overcoming deep-seated biases and learning to embrace love and acceptance. "Prejudice is something passed down from generation to generation," she said. But we can break that cycle if we're brave enough to face the truth and choose to change. Her words struck a chord with Walter. He realized that his behavior wasn't just the result of personal resentment but also a product of the beliefs instilled in him since childhood. The weight of this recognition lingered with him long after the workshop ended, sparking a deeper reflection on his actions and their origins. One evening, Walter sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across his face. Linda had gone to bed, and the house was silent. Walter picked up an old photograph from the table, a picture of him with his father taken many years ago. He recalled his childhood, when his father would often say, "You must always protect the values of our family. Never let anyone walk over you." But now, Walter realized those teachings had led him down the wrong path. He had hurt Marcus and his family simply because they were different. He had let his own family down, especially Linda, who had tirelessly tried to pull him out of the pit of hatred he had fallen into. In that moment, Walter broke down and cried. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to show vulnerability. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he also understood that he could do something to make amends. The next morning, Walter resolved to visit Marcus once again. But this time, it wasn't just to apologize, it was to take action. That morning, Walter stood in front of Marcus's house, holding a small bag of homemade cookies. Linda had helped him prepare them as a gesture of starting fresh. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The door opened, and Marcus stood there, a faint smile on his face. "Mr. Blake," Marcus greeted, his tone calm but his eyes curious. "What brings you here?" Walter hesitated for a moment before holding out the bag of cookies. I thought we could start over. These are cookies Linda made, but I helped a little too." He paused briefly, then continued. "I know my previous apology wasn't enough. I want to do more to show that I'm truly changing." Marcus accepted the bag, nodding. "I appreciate this, Mr. Blake. Actions matter more than words. Let's work together to build a better community." Walter left with a sense of relief. But he knew this was only the beginning. The very next day, he decided to get involved in one of the neighborhood improvement projects Marcus was organizing. He started by volunteering to help renovate the children's playground at the Central Park. Unaccustomed to community work, Walter initially felt awkward working alongside neighbors he had previously kept at arm's length. However, he soon realized that people weren't entirely dismissive of him. Some, like Mrs. Margaret, even offered words of encouragement. "It's good to see you here, Mr. Blake," Mrs. Margaret said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them." Her words gave Walter a boost of confidence. He began working harder, even lending a hand to others in the group. When the project was completed, Walter stood back and watched as children ran and played in the newly restored playground. His heart swelled with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. After weeks of participating in community activities, Walter felt he was finally ready to face Marcus again, this time with complete sincerity. One evening, he knocked on Marcus's door, carrying a cup of hot tea, and sat down with him in the living room. "Marcus," Walter began, his voice trembling, "I want to thank you for giving me a chance. And I also want to say that what I did to you and your family, it was unforgivable. But I hope that over time, through my actions, I can prove how truly sorry I am." Marcus looked at Walter for a long moment before replying. "Mr. Blake, not only do I forgive you, but I also feel you've taught me something about patience and grace. None of us are perfect, but I believe anyone can change if they're brave enough to confront themselves." Walter felt a wave of relief wash over him like never before. As he left Marcus's house, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, as if he had finally set down a burden that had weighed on his shoulders for years. Under Marcus's leadership, the Greenvale neighborhood gradually transformed. Those who once held prejudices began to open their hearts. Thanks to the programs Marcus and his team organized, Walter became one of the most active participants. helping with workshops and assisting families in need within the community. One day, Marcus held a gathering at the Central Park to thank everyone for coming together to build a stronger community. As he stepped onto the podium, Marcus saw Walter sitting in the front row, his face beaming with pride. Smiling, Marcus began his speech. "When I moved to Greenvale, I knew there would be challenges, but I never imagined I would meet people capable of such growth and inspiration. Together, we have built more than just a neighborhood, we have built trust, respect, and love." As the speech concluded, the park erupted with applause. Walter stood, walked up to Marcus, and extended his hand. "Thank you, Marcus. You've taught me how to be a better person." Marcus shook Walter's hand warmly, both men acknowledging the journey they had taken together, a journey of change, understanding, and the power of community. Walter had become a completely different man. No longer the rigid and hateful person he once was. He became an integral part of the community, always ready to lend a hand and support those around him. One morning, while Walter was working in his garden, Marcus walked over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat down on a bench in Walter's yard, chatting about family, work, and plans for the neighborhood's future. "Walter," Marcus said, looking at him with genuine warmth, "I think your story could be a valuable lesson for all of us. Have you ever thought about sharing it?" Walter paused to reflect, then nodded. "If it can help someone avoid the path I once took, I'd be glad to share." And so, Walter began telling his story at community meetings, schools, and even city events. His journey of transformation became an inspiration for many, helping people see that hatred is never the solution and that forgiveness and patience have the power to change lives. The Greenvale neighborhood not only became a better place to live, but also a symbol of unity and compassion. Marcus and Walter, 2 people who had once been on opposite sides, were now true friends, working together to create a community that anyone would be proud to call home.